using culture as the primary interview screen before you bring somebody in to the next stage of the interview is a way to solve the problem and basically make sure the culture gets kind of embedded as you're bringing in new employees. So really the defining of the culture doesn't need to happen until you bring in sort of people who are outside of that core founding team.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Leading the ScaleUp. It's the show that goes beyond the glossy headlines to explore the real stories behind business growth and leadership in high growth organizations. I'm your host, Ben Morton, leadership mentor, executive coach, and lifelong student of leadership. Joining me today is Peter Cohan, an author, educator, investor, and advisor to hundreds of startups and scale-ups across the globe. He's the author of Scaling Your Startup and Brain Rush, and teaches strategy and entrepreneurship at Babson College in Massachusetts. In this episode, we talk about the 4 stages of scaling a business, the hidden risks of skipping these foundational steps, and how some of the most successful founders retain their leadership edge by staying curious and hungry to learn. We also explore the concept of cultural carriers and how hiring for values, not just skills, can be the key to scaling without breaking your culture. Whether you're building a company from scratch, scaling a new division, or leading inside a fast-moving organization, there are insights here that will challenge how you think and lead. So, without any further delay, let's dive right in. Peter, let's dive straight in to the questions. Culture often struggles to keep up with growth when an organization is scaling. With that as the context, what have you seen as the most effective way to actually scale a culture without diluting it and to make sure that the culture stays intact and productive as the organization grows?
That's a very interesting question, and it kind of leads me to think about what exactly culture is, because it does have sort of in my view, kind of a squishy conceptual basis. But the way I think of it is it's what people do when the CEO is not looking over their shoulders. It's sort of the autopilot of the organization where hopefully people just know how to do the right thing and have the right values and then act on those values. So having said that, when I wrote my book, Scaling Your Startup, one of the things that I kind of realized afterwards, after talking about the book with one of my colleagues, is that culture really does not get articulated and defined in the first stage of scaling. It's only in the second stage of scaling, where you're trying to bring in people from outside the founding team, that you realize that you need to figure out a way of articulating the culture. So in that first stage, essentially, what I called winning your first customers, you have a founding team. They are doing all the different jobs and doing whatever it takes to win those customers and keep those customers and essentially get that company off the ground. And for some reason, most companies are, especially successful startups, are very good at hiring a founding team with a shared set of values. And they kind of work together well. And I've talked to many companies that were founded by people who had worked at another company together before they started their company, which brings to mind the company Toast, which is a Boston-based company, where all of the founders had worked at another company together. So they knew each other really well. And because of that, they worked really well together. And it wasn't until they needed to go outside of their founding team, when they wanted to really scale up the company, that they realized that they needed to hire people from the outside. And one of the things that I've learned in interviewing hundreds of CEOs is that when you hire people from the outside, there is a big risk, especially when the company is small, that you're going to poison the culture with one person who doesn't fit the culture. That person who you hired because you were in a hurry to get a certain skill, and that person had the technical skill that you lacked. And so you hired that person without really testing to see whether they fit the culture. They come into the company. It turns out pretty quickly that they're really different than everybody else, and everybody is finding that person to be extremely disruptive and wishing that person was not there. And the CEO is hoping that they'll just all get along somehow. And usually what happens is that they fire that person, but after a lot of not wanting to fire the person because the person is so disruptive. So the solution to avoiding this problem is what they did at Toast, which is that the founders of Toast kind of got the company to a level, I don't know if it was $20 million in revenue, but it was a level where they kind of recognized that, we're probably going to survive. We have a business model. It's going to be successful. We're going to make this work. And they looked at the people first of all, they tried to figure out, well, why did we get to this point? What were the things that we did that enabled us to be, successful? And the answer was, we were really good at going the extra mile for the customer. We were incredibly, and their customer, one of my first jobs was as a waiter, and I used to take orders on a piece of paper. This is sort of a digital device. It's sort of like an iPhone, very robust iPhone. If you dropped it, it wouldn't shatter. And you can put the order there. It sends it to the kitchen. You can order stuff. And basically their customers are restaurants. So they would go the extra mile for the restaurants. And that was their most important value. That was the thing that drove their success and got them to past that first stage of scaling. So what the CEO decided to do was, rather than the CEO dictating what the company would do, the CEO looked for the people in the company who most fit that core value of going the extra mile. And they were sort of thought of as culture carriers, people who really embodied the culture. And then they asked those people, interviewed those people and said, how would you articulate our culture? How would you define our values? And what stories would you tell that illustrate how those values are, useful for the company's growth? And based on that, that would be part of their, when new employees would come on. But before they would hire new employees, they incorporated ways of testing whether a new employee would fit with those values before they started asking them about whether they could actually add the skills that the company needed. So using culture as the primary interview screen before you bring somebody in to the next stage of the interview is a way to solve the problem and basically make sure the culture gets kind of embedded as you're bringing in new employees. So really the defining of the culture doesn't need to happen until you bring in sort of people who are outside of that core founding team.
Yeah, that's amazing. That makes perfect sense, Peter. And straight away, there are two follow-up questions from what you've just shared. The first one, if we go back to, you started answering my question by defining culture, which made me realize, actually, we should probably define what we mean by a scale-up or scaling up. So in your mind, how do you differentiate between a startup and a scale-up? Where's the tipping point, or what are some of the measures or indicators that we are moving from startup into scale-up?
Well, that is a key question. And when I first started writing the book, what I was thinking about was there must be these tiers of revenue. If you're above a certain revenue level, you have passed the first stage of scaling. And then I realized that those numbers are different in different industries, different for different companies. That was not going to be a useful way to articulate it. So I essentially ended up defining 4 stages of scaling. And the first stage of scaling I called winning your first customers. And it essentially means that, you have to have some product or service that is valuable enough for a customer to pay for it. And if you don't have that basic product market fit, you are basically never going to get through the first stage of scaling. If you do get product market fit and you can build up the revenue to a certain level, which in my mind was, somewhere in the $10 to $20 million range, then you would sort of establish that you have won your first customers. But when I wrote the book, also, there was this sort of model of how you would, and this is very focused on venture capital, your model of how you are going to get your company to an IPO. So how you're going to be able to give those investors an exit. And to do that, you need to have 100 million in revenue. So I was basically saying, okay, if you can get a company that's got 100 million in revenue, it's growing at 30 to 40% a year, that is what the IPO market looks for when they want to take something public. So there's some cutoff point where you've clearly established that you have a viable business, you've got customers, you've got growth, but it is not big enough to go public. So this leads to the second stage of scaling, which, as I noticed often during the period of time when the IPO market was open, companies would often skip that second stage of scaling and go right to the third stage of scaling, which is called sprinting to liquidity, which means you take all the venture capital that the venture capital firms are trying to dump into your company to make you grow really fast so you can get to $100 million in revenue, and you will essentially then be able to go public and they can get their money out. So they're always worried that they're going to be too late to get their money out, and therefore they are pushing the company to sprint to get to that $100 million and go public, and then this venture capital firm can realize their gains. Now, I'm not saying all venture capital firms look at it that way, but I definitely think that's sort of the unspoken thing, is that they don't want to come out and say, well, we just need to get our money out as fast as possible. But in fact, the way they're pushing companies to skip the second stage of scaling, go from the first stage to the third stage of scaling, can be an error. And the second stage of scaling, which they try to get people to skip, is something that I wrote about in the book, because even though people weren't doing it very often, I recognized that it was essential to creating a firm that would be around for a long time. And that second stage of scaling is what I called building a scalable business model, which doesn't really tell you very much, but if I describe it, maybe you'll get the idea, which is basically the idea of a scalable business model is that as the company grows, you are creating a clear path to positive cash flow. There is a way to change the way you do basic business processes that will allow you to bring in revenue at a faster clip and a higher rate of revenue growth than the growth in your costs. So you're figuring out ways to perform cash-consuming processes in your business much more efficiently so that you don't keep burning through cash as you grow. So the idea of building a scalable business model is that by the time you are ready to go public, you are generating positive cash flow. And you will continue to generate more positive cash flow as you get bigger after you go public. So that's the oft-skipped second stage of scaling. Now, what happens to a company if they skip the second stage of scaling and the IPO market just collapses, which is what happened in November of 2021. The IPO market essentially collapsed, and there were companies that were being told to skip the second stage of scaling, which were now getting a separate, different, and opposite message from their venture capital firms, which was, I'm not going to give you any more money. Good luck. You figure out how to survive. So that is why skipping the second stage of scaling can be bad, because you might be stuck in the third stage of scaling, having skipped the second stage, and suddenly the IPO market dries up and your venture capital firm is no longer interested in putting any more money into your cash emulating business. And then the fourth stage of scaling is one that is basically reserved for CEOs who have a true passion for building a company that changes the world, which is that this is after the company goes public. And now you have a leader, or you may not have a leader. Actually, that's one of the things that happens is there's a lot of turnover between the first stage and the fourth stage. But some CEOs, and in my view, the best CEOs are the ones that make it through all four stages, which the fourth stage of scaling I called running the marathon, where you are basically a public company and you want to keep growing as fast as you possibly can and exceed investor expectations. And that's a whole another discussion. But
it's a whole nother book probably as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a bit of a digression, but I started going on television, CNBC, back in the last millennium. I learned over time what makes stock prices go up and down. And I realized that is an entire subject, which I did write other books about this topic. But the key thing is those are the four stages of scaling. In my view, it becomes a scale up if you make it past the first stage.
Got you. And I still want to come back to my follow-up question from earlier on, but
yes,
linked to what you've just said, particularly around the second phase of scaling and building a sustainable business model. And it sounded like a big part of that really is around managing the cash flow. Do you think that's why over the last, do you think, maybe 10 years, we've seen such a rise in businesses that are operating on a subscription-based model, just because it enables that scaling?
The subscription-based model definitely emerged when the cloud became a thing. Basically, instead of people operating their own computer systems, they rented it out. And I think it was probably Salesforce.com that created one of the first subscription-based businesses. But just to sort of get back to the second stage of scaling, building a scalable business model, my favorite anecdote about this is a company that was founded by a gentleman who graduated from Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, which is where my daughter went. So I'm very proud of the fact that she went to Dartmouth. And he went to Dartmouth. He was this brilliant engineer, Lou Cern, who started a company that was doing monitoring of how quickly apps load up when you click on it. Is it taking a long time? If it's taking a long time, it's going to cost you customers. If it's working fast, that's good. He started a company to do that, but it was acquired by a company called Wiley Technology because he could not scale the business. He basically sold it for over $1 billion, which is pretty good. But basically, the problem he was having was he was selling this to companies. In order to grow, the cost of the salesperson was, say, $250,000, and they would learn the business, and after 6 months, they would leave. So essentially, he was throwing all this money at salespeople who were not sticking around long enough to essentially pay off and to generate the revenue needed. So he then took the money from the other company and he started a new company, and he totally rethought the way selling was going to work. And so he changed the strategy in what I thought was a brilliant way to eliminate the need for hiring expensive salespeople. And that is the most expensive process that makes it hard to have a scalable business model. If you can get, so basically what he did was he gave away the product for free for a small number of users, and then the users would be so delighted with the product that they would talk to their management and say, we need to have more people using this, and therefore we need to pay for a more fully functional version that will work with more people. And so it would do what they called inbound marketing. The customers would call up the company and say, how can I buy this thing? So essentially the customers became the salespeople, and they were bringing in the new contracts and they were saying great things about the product. So the engineers who were using it would go to conferences and talk about how great it was, and they essentially became the sales force. And so to me, this concept of turning your customers into your sales force is a fantastic way to scale, and having, word of mouth from happy customers, talking on social media or whatever conferences or however they share their experiences, maybe on open source platforms where they're doing things together with other engineers, became a fantastic way to grow the company without adding a lot of costs for each level of growth. So that's an example of how to turn an unscalable business model into a scalable business model.
So interesting and timely, Peter, actually. Literally over the last few months in my circle of friends who are all running, building small businesses or doing consulting, one of the topics of conversations that's cropped up quite a lot lately is giving away the product for free. Particularly a friend of mine is consulting with a software type tech business that was trying to sell the business, and then kind of one of the potential buyers, one of their main competitors, fell through. So my friend said, well, you could just make it completely free, make your software open source, and then charge for the implementation or the add-ons. And at the same time, I only recently learned the sort of founding and scale-up story of Google, which back in the day, like I'm sure you'll know this story, but I'm sure many listeners won't. But in the very first days of search engines, it was all about how quickly really it could load, to your point just now. But many of the search engine companies of the day, in order to make revenue, were covering their main search page with ads. And Google realized, actually, if we put nothing on it at all, no ads, so effectively we're giving Google away for free, it will load really quickly. To your point, users will have a great experience, they'll keep coming back. And that's a big part of Google's success story, which I find just fascinating, right? It is so counter to a lot of conventional business entrepreneurial wisdom, but it can have incredible results, right?
They did that, and I wrote about this in a couple of my books. And the interesting thing is they didn't have a business model. They had no revenue. There was another search engine that I used before then called Alta Vista, and I stopped using Alta Vista and started using Google because it was just producing better results.
Right.
And a lot of people just thought it was a superior search engine. And yes, it was free of all the ads and all the clutter, and it gave the answers. And so essentially, and the thing that I kind of thought was interesting was there was this other company that was doing some kind of search engine related advertisements. I think it was called Overture. And Google was trying to figure out a way of doing the advertising in such a way that they could make it unobtrusive and sort of almost helpful, almost giving you the links, these little keywords that were next to you barely noticed them as advertisements, and then have people competing to have their ads sort of at the top of the list so that people would be more likely to click on them. And that turned out to be, the core business that they're in now is search engine advertising. But for a long time, 3 years, they basically had no revenue, and their venture capital firms were fine with that. And then they decided they needed to come up with the revenue. So if you want to really make it simple, there's a model that I talk about in my classes, which is the loyalty effect, which I wish I had developed, but it was a book by a partner at Bain & Company, the Boston-based consulting firm. Essentially says happy customers come from happy employees, and happy customers basically give your company a high net promoter score, which means essentially they're very happy to recommend it to other people. And then the high net promoter score enriches the shareholders who pour more money into more happy people. And the whole cycle kind of gets bigger and bigger. And it's such a nice, simple idea. And it's so interesting to think about the opposite of loyalty, the disloyalty effect, and then you kind of understand why it works. So the disloyalty effect is essentially you hire somebody, they come in and they are immediately bombarded by misery, and they start looking for ways to get out of there. And while they're trying to get out of there, when the customers call, they ignore them and they treat them badly because they hate the company so much. And then they leave. Meanwhile, the customers getting the bad experience have to be lured in by discounts and promotions. And then they see they're getting terrible experience, and then they leave. And so now the company has to pay more money to hire new employees and advertise to bring in new customers. Meanwhile, the company is burning through cash and the whole thing just kind of disappears.
Hey, here's a quick question while you're listening. How strong is your senior leadership team, really? Are they enabling growth or are they holding you back? The Leadership Capability Scorecard gives you a clear snapshot of your organization's leadership capability. It shows you where your senior managers are excelling and where development is needed to scale successfully. It's free, takes just a few minutes, and gives you instant insights into whether your leadership team is set up for growth. Take the scorecard now. The link's in the show notes. Back to the episode. Peter, before I forget it, back to something I wanted to ask you linked to culture. The company you mentioned to start with, was it Toast?
Toast, yeah.
I think it's amazing how they went on to define their culture as they started to grow. And you said they did that by looking and understanding like what they'd done well that got them to where they are.
Yes.
To what degree do organizations who are tackling that challenge of trying to identify their culture, how do you strike that balance between looking back and understanding the cultural elements, the ways of doing things around here that have made you successful versus the ways of doing things and the culture that will make you successful in the next phase of growth? Because they're not always going to be the same, are they? I guess the reality is at that phase, there's going to be some cultural elements that exist from the past and some that are going to be perhaps aspirational to drive you on the next phase of the journey. So have you got any thoughts or tips on that to share with listeners?
If you look at Toast, I mean, I think the emphasis that they put on making their customers happy and going the extra mile for customers has not really changed. But I think what happens a lot when companies try to build a scalable business model, and particularly when they are scaling to liquidity, sprinting to liquidity, the third stage of scaling, is that the company needs to change what their top leadership team is doing. And they usually need to change the people. So this is another aspect of my book, is the 7 scaling levers. At each stage of scaling, there are things that management can do to enable the firm to reach to the next level of scaling. So in this case, to scale the company and start sprinting to liquidity, what they need to do is put in an organization structure where it's very organized around business functions. It's organized around sales, marketing, product development, finance, and there's not like one person who's sort of doing multiple jobs.
Yeah.
You're hiring people who have had the experience of working for a company that previously had a scalable business model to going public, and they were the head of that function. So they know how to scale marketing, and they know how to scale sales and product development, make it go from a one product company to a multiple product company operating all over the world. And they already have that experience, and they are very focused on how do we hire the best people to do this job of scaling the company. So it's essentially a new organization structure and new people. And most of the people who are on the original founding team are not functioning in that environment. They are essentially leaving. Very few of them can actually grow into the skill set that somebody who's already done it successfully in the past already has. So you're really not changing the culture so much as you're changing the organization structure, and you're changing who's in the jobs, which are 2 other scaling levers of the 7 scaling levers. Those are 2 other ones.
So are there any tips or watch outs during that phase? Because I've certainly come across this myself working with organizations where as an organization really starts growing, scaling, they have to put in more structure. That can create a tension, especially for the people who work within the organization, right? Because early on, it's been very close in terms of relationships. Everybody has done a bit of everything. There is less structure. It feels less formal. And yes, to scale, it's clear that you need that, but that's a change, right? And we know human beings can be resistant to change. So any particular tips for navigating that phase? It can be difficult for the people in the business, right? And you might lose some people you don't want to lose during that phase.
Yes, this is very true. And I was just watching a documentary on BlackBerry. I'm sure you've heard of BlackBerry.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you saw, there was a documentary. It's sort of like a fictionalized version of what happened to BlackBerry. But this is what happened. And so the funny thing about it is that the founder of the company, the CEO of the company, starts off being very nerdy and unkempt and all that, everything you'd expect. And then he brings in a Harvard MBA to be the co-CEO, who essentially knows nothing about technology, but seems to be pretty good at convincing investors to put money in and winning customers. And this founding CEO manages to stick around long enough so that by the time the company goes public, he has now changed his image. He's got swept back hair. He spends probably $1,000 getting his hair done. He's got a completely new wardrobe. He's sort of turned into what looked like a CEO.
Yeah.
But his friend, who he started the company with, who basically wasn't exactly clear what he did, but he was just there and sort of helped him solve all the problems, ends up essentially becoming increasingly irrelevant and ultimately fired by his former friend. So this is a long-winded way of saying that people do not like to part ways with their friends, but eventually the demands of the business essentially cause that friendship to not prevail over the needs of the business. And, in theory, you could sit down and tell all your friends that you started the company with, here's what we're going to be doing next. Very few of you will want to be in this environment, find a way out, or I'll have to probably replace you, and maybe you'll have to find a place. So you can have an upfront conversation with them and tell them this is happening, and it will still be painful. There are things in life, this is one of my little bits of wisdom that someday I'm going to give a last lecture about this, but one of my favorite little bits of wisdom is that sometimes you're in a situation where you have a choice between a bad outcome and a terrible outcome, and you should take the bad outcome and not kind of put your head in the sand. You've got to just be upfront, say, here, this is going to be bad, you're not going to like it. That's better than just sort of lying to everybody and then doing all this stuff and then, just because you don't want to have the unpleasant conversation. So this is one of those situations where you have the choice between bad and terrible outcomes. The interesting thing about the BlackBerry story is that the only person who made money on BlackBerry stock was the guy who was friends with the original co-CEO, who sold his stock as soon as he was fired, before the whole thing collapsed, when Apple came out with the iPhone, which basically brought the company down. So he got out of it before the effect of the iPhone had destroyed the BlackBerry, and he made money. So essentially, he had probably the happiest outcome.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And when you was talking there, I thought you was going to move on to something that I know you're keen to talk about. So let me ask you a few questions about this now. And that's really to look at this concept of cognitive hunger versus cognitive locking. So you talk about cognitive hunger. So what is it, Peter? Give us an overview of what we mean by cognitive hunger, please.
I happened upon an article in this obscure academic journal. It was called the Harvard Business Law Journal, which I didn't know existed. I heard about the Harvard Law Review, but never heard of this. But I was reading this article, and it said, we have found that 0.4% of all founders are still running their companies 3 years after it goes public.
0.4.
0.4%. So the other 99.6% are gone by the time you are 3 years into the public company. And I was reading this article and I said, oh boy, I can't wait to sort of find out what distinguishes that 0.4% from everybody else. And there was nothing. The article had nothing in there. It had the numbers, which were fascinating. And so I set about trying to figure out what makes the difference between, the 0.4% and the other 99.6%. And it turns out I knew some of these people who were founders and CEOs of companies that had been publicly traded for years. And they were really successful. And so I started interviewing them. I interviewed about 30 of them. And then I started to see a commonality, which was that they never stop learning. They are always trying to learn new things. They started off the company before it had a product. They had no employees. And now they are learning how to run a public company, how to talk to investors, how to deal with the financial statements and reporting and legal requirements and all that stuff. And they're still learning, and the company is still growing, and it's still successful. This is a very rare human being. And what is it about these people? And it turns out that it's this thing where they just have this tremendous amount of some kind of intellectual humility. I wouldn't call them, there's a certain amount of self-confidence, but they are also willing to admit that they don't know something. And this is, by the way, on my list of things in my last lecture, this is another thing, which is, as a person who is in school and you're always supposed to know all the answers, I was always afraid to not know something. I wouldn't do well on the test if I didn't know something. The whole, academic system is set up so that you'll know all the answers and you'll write them out correctly on the test. But this is something that I found really interesting, is that they are willing to admit that they don't know. They're not going to bluff. They're not going to pretend they know something they don't know. They're just going to say, I don't know. And, maybe have an idea about how they're going to get an answer. But to me, that's like very, very important, because I think leaders are afraid to appear vulnerable in front of other people. And if you are able to admit that you don't know the answer, and, a lot of times people are thrown questions that have not been answered before, they don't know. And they have to admit that they don't know, and they have to come up with a process for finding the answer. And so this is actually what most of my courses are all about, is teaching students how to admit what they don't know, and a process for finding out answers based on facts and weighing evidence and coming up with real, substantive, independently thought of answers to new and difficult problems that people are going to be facing. So this is what they do that's different. And it manifests itself in 5 specific business processes, ranging from making sure your business is solving the right problem to training your successor as CEO so that you can sustain the company after you depart the CEO role.
What you've just mentioned there really, really resonates, Peter, and I consider myself very lucky that I learned a similar lesson probably just before my 15th birthday. And who knows, maybe this story will make it into one of your lectures with your students. But just after my 15th birthday, I went off for a 2-day assessment weekend to hopefully join the British Army as an officer. And before I went down, there was a major from the Army recruiting team came to my school to do the preliminary interview and to brief me on what to expect from this 2-day selection weekend. And still to this day, I find it incredible that age 15, the British Army could spot leadership potential in kind of young boys and girls, because that's what we were really at that age.
Yes.
But I can remember it still, and I've told the story many times, but I remember as if it were yesterday. I was sitting in the school careers office. I can picture it perfectly. And the major was talking me through all the different exercises and tasks I would have to do. He said there'll be a series of practical tasks where there's no leader. They just want to observe your teamwork and who naturally comes to the fore. And he said you'll get one exercise, and it's the very typical sort of planks and barrels, crossing a chasm, that sort of stuff. He said there'll be one task where you are the designated leader. He said you'll be taken to one side. You'll be given your briefing for the task, what you need to achieve, what resources you've got, what the constraints are, and you'll get, say, 5 minutes planning time. This is the bit that I remember. He said, at the end of your 5 minutes planning time, if you don't have a plan, that is absolutely fine. Not your job as a leader to have all of the answers. He said, if that's the situation, he said, just go to your team, brief them. You were briefed on what you've got to achieve, what the constraints are, and ask them for ideas. He said, you then get the ideas, give credit where credit's due, the execution of the task. And as I said, I feel so grateful to have learned that so early on, because it stood me in such good stead as a leader throughout my whole career. And to your point, it's a lesson that a lot of leaders miss or have the opposite view of, don't they? That if I don't have every single answer, then in some way that is a failing of me as the leader. But I think it's crazy, really. Why would we recruit loads of really smart, driven, intelligent, capable people and then try and be the one that comes up with all of the answers? It makes no sense when you actually pause and step back.
Exactly. I mean, I think that, I think that's another related issue, which is your sort of leadership style. Are you somebody who basically believes in command and control, namely, I'm going to order you to do something and you will compete to be the one who implements it the best and fastest, or at least the fastest? Or you are somebody who basically says, I'm going to set a vision, I'm going to have goals, and I'm going to remove all the obstacles to having my outstanding people figure out solutions to that on their own and employ their capabilities. So to me, it's like a total waste to hire somebody talented and then treat them like an extension of your pinky. That to me it's actually very interesting. It sort of becomes an opportunity for, if you're competing with a company that's managed that way, you as a leader have an opportunity to essentially take advantage of what the value deficit that poorly managed company is going to create in the market, and you can kind of compete by winning the customer, by giving the customer overall value, by listening to the customer, by having your people listen to the customer, understand what their real unmet needs are, and make sure they're solving the right problem for the customer.
Back to that piece of research in the obscure Harvard publication you stumbled across. I guess there's an assumption built into that. If it was only 0.4% of organizations still have the leader in place.
Yeah, it was 0.4% of the companies they surveyed. They didn't do like a comprehensive study of all organizations in the world. But yeah, it was that's what it was.
So I guess the assumption there, though, is that that 0.4%, that those organizations are successful, right?
Yes, they were successful at the time that the article was written. Whether they're still successful or not, I don't know. I didn't go and read I don't know if they even published the names of all the CEOs. I can't remember that part. Because actually, if they had, I probably would have tried to interview them. So they probably didn't publish them. Maybe they had them somewhere in their computer, but they didn't publish that. So I definitely talked to the CEOs who had done that, and who all the ones I talked to were, their companies were successful. And there was one company that really interested me where I talked to the CEO, and then he appointed a new CEO who was his successor, who he had hired a few years before. And the new CEO has now accelerated the growth rate of the company beyond where it was when the founder and CEO left. So this was one example that really sticks in my mind, because he did a spectacular job of hiring and developing a successor, which is the last thing where the founder has to really prevail. Otherwise, you have a company that does great while that person is the CEO, and then they bring in a successor who runs it into the ground, which is sort of what Steve Ballmer was doing with Microsoft after Bill Gates put him in charge. So that's an interesting point, is that in order to really pass my cognitive hunger test, you have to do the right things on all of those sort of steps.
Makes perfect sense. If that's cognitive hunger, the opposite being cognitive lock-in, can you tell us just briefly what you mean by cognitive lock-in, and perhaps what are some telltale signs that an individual could look out for to give them an indication of kind of where they're sitting on a spectrum, if there is such a thing?
Yeah, I mean, the basic concept behind cognitive lock-in is something called confirmation bias. This is one of the things I've written a lot of articles about for a long time. And, there was this great book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and he talked about all these different irrational things that people do. And confirmation bias is by far the one that I observed most commonly among CEOs that have cognitive lock-in, is that sometime during their career, they were successful at something. And they now frame every new situation that they face or their company faces by looking into that frame that made them successful in the first place. And so they then look for answers that are the same answers that they got for that problem when they were successful. So it's almost like this rush of adrenaline that they got from what may have been just luck, that they happened to make the right decision many years ago. They want to have, it's like a drug thing where they can't get the same high without having the same, dose of dopamine or whatever the brain chemical is. So they're trying to do the same thing over and over again, and somebody gives them a new solution or looks at it a different way, and they fire the person, or they ignore the person and sideline them, and eventually they leave. They don't encourage debate. They encourage people to compete to see who can give the CEO what the CEO expects to get because of their prior experience. So essentially, they want something they want information that confirms what they already believe. They do not want to learn new things. And that kind of behavior manifests itself, and you're afraid to say what you think. You are afraid you're going to be shot down, ignored, somehow publicly humiliated if you do not do what the person in charge says. So that is a very common dynamic that happens in companies that have cognitive lock-in. And an example of this is one of the other things I did was I started having students do sort of 5 whys analysis for all sorts of strategic issues that happened. And one of my favorite kinds of 5 whys analysis is to look at a company that goes bankrupt and ask, why did it go bankrupt? The example that I started off with was Circuit City. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it was basically a company that was a electronics retailer. It started off, selling TVs, and then it sold us computers and all that kind of stuff, like Best Buy. And does Best Buy exist in England? I don't know, but so you're familiar with Best. So it's like Best Buy. They went bankrupt. Essentially, the reason it went bankrupt, if you do the sort of 5 whys analysis, the 7th why is that if you look at the compensation for the CEO, in order to get a $6 million bonus, had to reach a certain earnings per share target. So in order to do that, what he decided to do is fire 3,400 salespeople who knew how to help customers and replace them with, 2,000 inexperienced, low-paid people who knew nothing. In the process of doing that, of course, customers were furious, complaining all the time. They left and went to Amazon and Best Buy, and then they were stuck with all this inventory that customers weren't buying. But before all that happened, the CEO got his $6 million bonus, and then the company went bankrupt. So I'm sort of quickly going through it really fast, but the essential point I'm trying to make is, that you can get into an awful lot of trouble if you have this sort of confirmation bias, and especially if the confirmation bias is linked to a piece of a bonus system and compensation system that leads people to do things that are not in the best interests of the long-term success of the company.
Yeah, amazing. Peter, very conscious of your time. I'd love to finish up with a few quick-fire questions to round out our conversation. The first one, what would you say is the most overrated piece of leadership advice that you commonly hear?
I would say it's probably you have to be charismatic to be a great leader. I would say that is, vastly overrated. Some people are naturally charismatic. You can't really become charismatic if you're not charismatic. And just because you're not charismatic doesn't mean you can't be a great leader. So I think that is probably the one that comes to mind.
Great. What is one tech trend, perhaps, that you think leaders, business leaders, entrepreneurs are underestimating right now or not paying enough attention to?
I would say it's quantum computing. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to the CEO of a quantum computing company. He has a PhD from MIT, and I was talking to him, and it was amazing how he was explaining the value of this technology in non-technical terms. So even somebody like me could see very obviously why this was valuable. And I will tell you that it's something that reduces tremendously the amount of energy that is required to train and operate a generative AI model. And it really could have a tremendous benefit to essentially reducing the amount of energy required to do technology services related to AI. Is one example. It also does a lot of other things much more efficiently. So it actually is surprisingly practical and useful and will become more so. So I don't think people are paying attention to that.
Amazing. Final one. This ties in nicely, actually. You've mentioned a few times in our conversation your final lecture that you might give one day. So on that theme, if you could go back and give your younger self one piece of advice for the future that would have served you well in the career that you've had, what would it be?
Well, I would say I was going to sort of answer something like that question, which is essentially, what do I wish I had known before starting to invest in startups? So I did have an answer for that, which is that the biggest reason that companies fail is if they are trying to solve the wrong problem. When I look at the companies that I invested in that failed, they were trying to solve a problem that was not really the right problem. And so in my scaling book, I talked about 4 tests that you have to make sure that you are solving the right problem. And I won't get into them all now, but if I had known that before I started investing, I probably would have made fewer money-losing investments.
Brilliant. Peter, just before we wrap up, because you've mentioned them a few times, do you want to just give us the titles of your books that are relevant to what we've been talking about today, please?
Yes. The first book is called Scaling Your Startup. And the second book, which I did not mention, but it's related to generative AI, which came out last July. It's my most recent book. My 17th book is called Brain Rush, How to Invest and Compete in the Real World of Generative AI. And Brain Rush is supposed to be sort of a takeoff on the gold rush concept, but the brain is substituted for gold.
Nice.
So yeah, those are the 2 relevant books.
And for everybody listening, I'll make sure we pop links to your books in the show notes.
Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really enjoyed chatting to you. It's been a fascinating exploration of how to successfully lead a scale up, which I've certainly enjoyed. And I'm sure everybody listening will take huge value from. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for inviting me.
Before you go, let me just say thank you once again for tuning in to this episode of Leading the ScaleUp. And a huge thank you to Peter Cohan for sharing such rich and thought-provoking insights with us all. From defining culture through lived behaviours to spotting the difference between cognitive hunger and cognitive lock-in in senior leaders. And always, if you found today's conversation useful, please consider subscribing and leaving us a quick review. It really does help us reach more leaders navigating the challenges of scaling organizations. And finally, if you're wondering how your leadership team stacks up against the demands of scale, then do check out my Leadership Capability Scorecard. It's a free tool that gives you a snapshot across 9 essential areas, helping you identify your strengths and where to focus next. You'll find the link in the show notes. Until next time, lead well, stay curious, and as always, lead on.